No response. She's crashed into another tower at a different position.
One strength of the Halo franchise is its ability to convey the sense that ancient history has ancient history. The Halo games take place in the 2550s, but are built on the legacy of the Halo arrays, which fired approximately 100,000 years ago. The Halos themselves act as a climax to the Forerunner Flood conflict, which has roots both in the human Forerunner War 10,000 years even earlier, but also the Forerunner Precursor conflict some 10 million years even before that. These events compound on each other to give this sense that ancient history has ancient history. While these ancient events have impacted Halo's story in a general sense, they affect the Covenant more precisely. The Covenant sprout from the Sanshayum history. The Sanshayum were once allies with humans against the Forerunners long ago. Later they were indexed for preservation by the Librarian, and then reseeded on their homeworld of Janjor-Com. This homeworld happened to house a large number of Forerunner techno-relics, is what we'll call them. And so they developed faster than many other species, and due to these relics, they started to revere the Forerunners and their technology. It is often supposed that the Sanshayum misinterpreted the Forerunners' message of going on the Great Journey, by which the Forerunners meant firing the Halo arrays, as a means to transcend into some kind of godhood. And while that is true, we can say a bit more than that. The prophets, or Sanshayum, were left with a discontinuous or non-systematic data set of information that they recovered from Forerunner artifacts. Thus, they had to reconstruct an understanding of the Forerunners from scratch with the information that they had available to them. And along the way, they had to fill in the gaps as best as they could. Their reconstruction of the Forerunners creates a skewed interpretation and a unique worldview about the Forerunners, through which they filter new information through a kind of confirmation bias. So the prophets were in fact doing history, but it had a methodological problem and started to be led astray by their own ideology. This caused them to stubbornly refuse anything contrary to their beliefs. And this would eventually cause an untold amount of evil and suffering across the galaxy. But in its nascent form, it's hard to really fault the Forerunners for doing this historical process. The task of reconstructing the Forerunner society from a few techno-relics is a hard task. What the Forerunners were doing is very similar to how Latin-speaking Western Europe, in the post-Roman Empire context, lacked its literary connection to the Greco-Roman world. Western Europe had to reconstruct a Greco-Roman worldview based on the texts available to them. C.S. Lewis argues Western Europe systematized their remaining texts from the Greco-Roman world to make everything fit together coherently. What results from this process is a thoroughly medieval conception of the world that is, in fact, an interpretation of the Greco-Roman world, not its recreation. We can say that the Covenant were doing something similar with the Forerunners. They were reinterpreting, reimagining the Forerunners, rather than recreating them. The Covenant was born from war. It lived in war and died by war. It started from a war between the prophets and elites. The founding document of the Covenant, the Writ of Union, is a peace and reconciliation treaty following the devastating war. This covenant would fundamentally revolve around the faithful partnership between these two species. Faithfulness to their common benefit and to the task of finding more Forerunner relics becomes a foundational mission for the Covenant as a political entity. The inclusion of other species did not change this core element of the Covenant. Now, many species display reverence for Forerunners. Not only in the present day, but even back when the Forerunners were around, they were revered as gods. And the Librarian was seen as a goddess by many species. The continuation of that reverence centuries later is not unexpected. In fact, thanks to the Librarian's indexation, many species probably retain a tradition that ties their evolution or creation back to the Forerunners, as a kind of memory of that receding event. This would create a perceived creator-created relationship between modern alien life and the Forerunners. Think about this. In-game we come across Forerunner installations like Halo, a shield world, or even the Ark. These are huge artificial living spaces that also function as weapons, or in the Ark's case, a factory. These giant space stations present a sense of awe to those who encounter them, even us players in-game. Now imagine encountering such places in real life. Could we conceive of what kind of emotions would be evoked in us upon encountering a Halo? When people today travel to historic sites across the world, they get this sense of awe being in the presence of history. We can only imagine how that sense of awe would be magnified in the presence of these alien space installations that are immeasurably old and powerful. And the sense that I want to convey is that actually treating the Forerunners as divine in some way would make perfect sense within the landscape of the Halo universe. Now, the Covenant revere Forerunner tech like the Halos or the Dreadnought in High Charity. They treat their technology as sacred objects or places. In fact, the Covenant uses religious terminology to talk about technology more generally. They even call grenades holy flare or cleansing flame. Of course, this is an aesthetic choice that synthesizes technology and spirituality together, but their use of religious language for technology may be more embedded than a simple aesthetic choice. For the Covenant, it is likely that science and religion are interwoven and cannot be separated. While science in our history is a common human impulse, and so is to be found in every culture, modern Western science emerges from a Christian religious landscape in Europe and North America during the Enlightenment. Now, if we were to compare the task of theology, that is to understand God, and the task of science, which is to examine existence, we can come to recognize that they are different tasks. In Christianity, God is seen as transcendent. He has made everything, but he is not anything that he has made. He is beyond it. If we were to get rid of the jargon, we could say that God is not existence, but that he has made everything that exists. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I'll try and refrain from speaking beyond my own means here, but it seems to me that science emerges as a method of observation and deduction of the world around us, of existence. The formation of hypotheses arises from observation and are proven or disproven through testing and peer review and reproduction. Because God is not existence in that term, then an observation of and deduction of God is a task beyond the scope of the scientific approach. And what I really mean to say here is what I said at the beginning, the task of theology, that is to understand God, and the task of science. You can be a good scientist and a religious Christian, but you don't need to be. The religious beliefs are simply separate from the scientific task. But for the Covenant, they know the Forerunners are material and corporeal. They can be observed, they can be studied, and the Covenant can test these techno-relics that remain from the Forerunners. That means that the theological task of understanding the Forerunners and the scientific task of understanding the world around them are one and the same, because the Forerunners remain within the observable existence. And this simple difference of having a non-transcendent object of reverence means that the Covenant science and religion remain part and parcel, inseparable from one another. We could say rather cheekily that you cannot be an atheist Covenant scientist because that just wouldn't make sense in their worldview. And we can add something more to this topic. When humans conduct science, we do so as pioneers of the unknown. We are, as far as we know, the most advanced species that we've encountered. And so our task is to explore outside of us into the great unknown and to make sense of the wild mystery of life that has been untamed and left untouched by anyone else, because no one else has solved those mysteries. We are the first to take that step into the great beyond. And so we can say that our science is pioneering new advancements that have never been done. But the covenant cannot conceive of the world in that manner, because they know with certainty that the forerunners existed prior to them and were magnitudes greater than them in science and knowledge. They look out at the mysteries of the universe and see that the forerunners have already uncovered and studied them. So they cannot be pioneers. They cannot be imaginative and creative in that sense. Their task of science is imitation and reproduction and reverse engineering. They take the advancements of the forerunners and make it their own. It would be very foolish for them to think that they can make advancements in science that are separate from what the forerunners have already done. So this idea of creating new solutions and new technology, new understanding, cannot exist apart from the imitative process of copying the forerunners. Their conception of science is to catch up to what the forerunners have already done. And so not only can we sort of step back for a moment and say science and religion are interwoven for the covenant, rather we can say more explicitly the conception of science is greatly altered by the covenant's knowledge of the forerunners. And a human conception of science, especially in our world today, is affected by this understanding that we are the most advanced species that we've encountered, and there isn't life out there that is more advanced than us. I think that's really fascinating to just think about on its own, how our conception of science is altered by whether or not there is a species more advanced than us. In Halo 3's level, The Covenant, Truth speaks about the long-planned treachery of the elites. And to the Arbiter, he says the elites never believed in the Great Journey. His accusations are really a confession. He was the one who had long been planning treachery against the elites, and he himself had long since stopped believing in the Great Journey. When the prophets of truth, mercy, and regret learned that the Forerunner glyph for reclamation actually meant reclaimer, they denied and concealed this truth. But they continued to act as religious figures for the Covenant, thus holding on to power. In an ironic twist, the history of the prophets, in wanting to be like the Forerunners, would copy their cover-up and hold on a desperate grasp of power. And this would show its deadly consequences. They would enact a genocidal campaign against humanity to cover up their own deception. Let me embark on a brief detour here. Albert Camus, in his work The Rebel, provides a great insight into a famous quote by Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, Camus says, did not create a project to kill God. He looked at Christianity and found God dead. Nietzsche was looking at German Protestantism that was influenced by the likes of Schleiermacher, Feuerbach, and Strauss, among others. You can see Karl Barth's work, Protestant Thought from Rousseau to Ritschl, to learn more about these figures. But this German Protestantism used Enlightenment methods of rationalism, naturalism, and materialism to some extent to interpret Jesus not as the God-man who stands in solidarity with human suffering and who dies to save humans, but rather as the best human of humanity. Camus suggests the following. In this perspective, God's salvation cannot stand in solidarity with humans. Instead, it is a demand for humans to sacrifice their best representative. Humanity must be robbed of their best in order to be saved. This is an unjust robbery, not salvation, and thus the crucifixion of Jesus becomes a revolting act of tyranny. It is no longer a moment of solidarity. What Nietzsche saw when he looked at this German Protestantism were thinkers who rejected the divinity and thus unintentionally brought in this theology of injustice. And they were really rejecting the core of Christianity itself, but they still propagated Christianity's rituals, practices, and morality. They practiced a form of Christianity without any of its essence. Nietzsche sees this and calls it what it is, the death of God. God is dead, he remains dead, and we have killed him. And in turn, it also happens to be an appropriate critique to make of the prophet of truth. Unlike German Protestants who employed philosophical methods to interpret the Christian tradition, the prophet of truth learned the truth of the Forerunner's legacy from mendicant bias and AI from the Forerunner flood conflict. When Mendicant bias showed them that humans were the reclaimers, that made belief in the Great Journey impossible. It was just completely dismantled. However, instead of reforming the covenant to accommodate these inconvenient truths, the prophets propagated the covenant and the Great Journey, despite knowing its falsehood. In turn, what this means is that to pursue their vision of the Great Journey, everyone else must be sacrificed, and their salvation becomes an act of mass murder on a galactic scale. This twisted salvation, which is really just an injustice, is seen in the long history between the prophets and the elites. For a long time, the prophets took the best of the elites and made them into arbiters, soldiers who would go on suicide missions to protect the covenant. It was a convenient way of eliminating the strong elites who could pose a threat. In fact, when the prophets turn from the truth that Mendicant bias told them, that is the moment where the covenant breaks. Because from then on, the prophets are no longer acting with faithfulness towards the elites. The elites become enemies who stand in conflict with these new goals of concealing the truth. The prophet of truth had long since planned the destruction of the elites, both in the novel First Strike and as seen in Halo 2 and Halo 3 ODST. Truth had been preparing fleets of brutes to replace the elites and strike them down. In ODST specifically, we see brutes killing elites prior to the official Great Schism that would occur shortly afterwards. And our actions as the Master Chief in destroying Halo and killing the Prophet of Regret were serendipitous for Truth, who used them to accelerate his own political plays. Truth lives up to the Latin name of his species, the Perdifia vermis, the treacherous worms. It's what all prophets are called, but he embodies that term specifically. Worm is a specific term that's used for Satan in Dante's Divine Comedy, and so you need to take it as a straightforward reference to Satan. Others, such as Installation 00 and Rocket Sloth, have noted the similarities between Halo 3 ODST and Dante's Inferno. This is more than just an Easter egg. The actual name for the prophets is a reference to Satan. In turn, we can characterize the covenant under the Prophet of Truth as a satanic-led political religious entity, one that blazes a genocidal trail of death across space to ultimately enact the greatest murder in history, the firing of the Halos. Think about this. The Forerunners fired the Halos as a last resort, and only after indexing as many species as they could for survival. But Truth takes no steps to protect life. He wants to fire the Halos and so kill everything in the galaxy for no reason. For Truth, the Great Journey is a lie, and the Forerunners and their legacy humans are dead, and the actions of the Covenant are properly described as meaningless. And as a last twist of irony, in wanting to be like the Forerunners, the Covenant become the antithesis of the mantle of responsibility. If I had to try and bring everything together, I would characterize the Covenant as a horrific irony. The prophets, in wanting to be like the Forerunners, would become their opposite. They are an imitation without wisdom, blinded by their own ideology, and they fail to see the Forerunners correctly out of reverence for them. But that being said, I think the Covenant are actually pretty well thought out. Within a context of Halo's landscape, their development makes sense. Their religion and devotion to the Forerunners makes sense. The political upheaval and politicking and backstabbing, that all makes sense as well. It might be easy to dismiss everything about the Covenant as religious fanatics, but we can think if humans are placed in a similar situation, having access to Forerunner artifacts, human history may have developed on similar lines. Now, we can always say more about these kind of topics, but that's going to have to do for today. I do hope at the very least that a very brief, quote-unquote, analysis of the Covenant will lead to a greater enjoyment of the Halo games when you next find yourself playing them.